Hey guys, Into the End here, back for another Eternal video. I am going to go back to and revisit an old deck, one of my old favorites. I've been playing a lot of ranked with all the sort of new shiny toys with the new set, but after all and said, I wanted to go back to one of my all-time favorites, the Echo Revenge deck, using the Elysian Pathfinder, giving your revenge units Echo, and then from that point on, just recurring them over and over again for a lot of value. And I just really like this deck, and of all the decks I've ever played, I always come back to this when I'm bored, and when I'm sick of grinding tier 1 decks, grinding ladder, I always come back to this one. It's one of my favorite decks, and I just said that like 3 or 4 times, didn't I? But yeah, this deck's super fun, and it's got just the right amount of gimmick, and um, and also semi-competitive as well. So just the right amount of gimmick and competitiveness for this to be something that I enjoyed to play, because you don't lose all your games. Usually with a purely gimmicky decks, you just lose all your games and you win 1 of 10, and it gets really demoralizing after a while. This one, I think I have an above 50% win rate with this deck. I do steadily and very slowly climb the ladder ranks with this deck. I would say not a super high win rate, but not 50-50, definitely above 50%. So my version is slightly different than some of the ones you may see online. The main difference being I have a very focused theme on the recursion of the Echo units. I actually run only 2 copies of Elysian Pathfinder because I find this card to be pretty mediocre if you draw too many copies of it, and especially because if you play it and it gives itself Echo, it really slows down your deck. So in this version, ideally what I like to do is I like to just simply rise to the challenge, the Pathfinder, whenever I need it. And so having 2 copies of Pathfinder and 4 copies of Rise to the Challenge, plus 4 quarries, plus 3 schemes, you have plus 4 inspires. You have a lot of ways to actually find it. I've never really had a game where I needed it and didn't have it. So this deck, I focused a lot more on consistency and reliability of drawing the right cards, and that's why you see a lot of cantrips. You have 4 inspire, 4 quarry, 3 schemes, all of which will draw you additional cards and go through your deck faster to find the pieces that you need. Not to mention the destiny triggers off of your Echo units, or sorry, revenge units, will also draw you more cards. So this deck is surprisingly consistent. It's consistently bad in the early game and consistently pretty decent in the mid game and very good in the late game. I have 3 Smuggler Stash and 2 Dark Returns, and that's a lot of ways to bring things back. Smuggler Stash is exceptionally good in this deck because once you have a couple copies of these dead units into your yard with the Destiny ability, then basically playing Smuggler Stash is to put 2 units into play, draw 2 additional cards. That's a lot of value for Smuggler Stash. And sometimes you even bring back the single copy of Starsteel Daisho, which this card actually wins games on its own sometimes, and people just don't expect it. If you're playing against black control, Felon control, a rise to the challenge for a Daisho can often seal the deal. And of course, you back that up with some torch and some slays and some harsh rules to clear the way, and you can finish an opponent very quickly, usually within 2 turns, because with rise to the challenge, this is a 6/4, and that's 12 damage per turn, and you would have usually hit your opponent a few times with a Piercing Grief and Stonepowder Alchemist, so they're usually not at 25 life. So 2 turns is usually what you need to finish off the game. So the Starsteel Daisho gives you a non-linear alternate way of attack against a heavy control decks that likes to deal with units. So right now, Temporal Control is very popular, Fallen Control is super popular, and even a lot of people playing Horror Control nowadays, and also Argenport Control. This card is good against all of them, except Temporal Control, which has a disjunction in their main deck. But it's very good against all of the other control decks. And having 1 copy essentially means having 5 copies that you can, because you can search for it, and when it dies, you can bring it back 3 times. So it's essentially having 4 copies in your deck. That's actually pretty good inevitability against control decks that can't deal with weapons. So Inspire, because it's an old staple in the Armory decks before Inspire got nerfed to be 2 casting costs. It used to be 1. And I think that 2 is still playable in this deck because I don't have a lot of things to do on 2. And My game plan actually is just to kill my opponent with my Echo units. So giving your Piercing Groove +1/+1 or giving your Stone Powder Alchemist +1/+1 is actually within my game plan. And there's a lot of games where you do win by simply attacking your opponent with 4, 5, or 6 Piercing Greaves once they have gotten Echo. So Inspire is actually quite good in this deck. Every unit that the Inspire hits, except for the Elysian Pathfinder, is good. So you're really hoping that you don't you don't get the Pathfinder with your Inspire triggers. There's a couple of tricks to playing this deck. Everything in this deck starts with the Elysian Pathfinder, which is kind of counterintuitive because I cut 2 copies of the card. But usually, what you want to do is you can play your Echo units out fine just for blocking and some random incidental life gain and some damage. But ultimately, what you want to do is you want to go through your deck and search as quickly as you can for Rise to the Challenge, or straight up to the, so that you can tutor for the Pathfinder or simply find the Pathfinder. And once you play the Pathfinder once, everything is turned on. At that point, you will use all of your Rise to the Challenge, schemes, and quarries to find that one unit that has Echo. And the idea is you will build on that unit over and over again. Whatever unit it hits, it could be a Piercing Greave, or it could be the Alchemist, it doesn't really matter. You want to get to that as quickly as you can, play them, let them die, because it's important that they die. Once they die, then you can start Dark Returning and Smuggler Stash Snipping back, and each time you do it, they multiply 2 to 4. And that's how you win the game. You just overwhelm your opponent with a lot and lots of copies of these cards. And when you bring them back and they Echo and they Destiny, you will end up drawing a tremendous amount of cards every turn. When you draw that many cards, you're bound to get into Torches, Harsh Rules, Slays, and Die Shows, which will help you clear the path and overwhelm your opponent with pure card advantage at that point. And if all fails, one of the final win conditions, like I've already mentioned, is once you've drawn that many cards, and if you still couldn't kill your opponent, chances are your opponent has a deck that's very good against units. At that point, you go to your second plan, which is to use the Die Show backed up with Harsh Rules to kill your opponent by doing 12 damage per turn. So that's the overall theme of the deck. It is quite weak in the early game because you have not a lot of interaction. You only have 4 Torch, 2 Varus Favor, and 3 Slays for the first 3 turns. Any deck that likes to go very wide with a lot of 1/1 tokens and then attack you with Bandit Queen or Rally, your chances are you're going to lose to those decks unless you're very lucky and you get to cash Harsh Rule on turn 5 with a relatively high life total that allows you to draw yourself back into the game by drawing a lot of your life gain cards. That would be your only chance. Otherwise, you're quite weak in the early game, so sometimes against the super aggressive decks, you kind of just pretty much, it's an auto concede. You don't concede, but it's pretty much a concession. And that is also by design of the deck. I could put in more plagues or other cards that allows us to clear the board early, but I've chosen not to do that because it will weaken our game against every other deck. So I think I would rather this deck be better against mid-range and late-game decks and weaker against, and sort of just give up that early game aggro. Whereas if I started sort of gearing the deck towards the early game to fight the early game decks, you're then weakening yourself to the mid-range and late-game decks to give yourself a slight edge against the early decks. Because remember, just because you add in 4 copies of Plague, it doesn't mean you'll draw into them. You could still lose to the early game aggro decks by simply not drawing those Plagues. And that's one of the problems with having 75 card decks with a high degree of variance. So those are the reasons why I've chosen to design the deck this way. I'm going to play a few games with this deck. For those of you who know about this deck, may not be very this is certainly not a revolutionary deck. It's just an evolution of existing ideas that I have tweaked a little bit to my own personal taste. So I understand if you don't really like this deck, but hopefully I'll have something more exciting for you on the next video. Thanks for watching.